What happens when silence is forced into iron? The question lingers like smoke, curling through the air before settling heavy on the heart. On a Louisiana plantation in the year 1850, silence was not absence. It was command, obedience, and survival. It was the hush that followed the crack of a whip, the muting of songs that once belonged to free mouths, the swallowing of screams when iron struck flesh. And it was in the kitchen, among the fire, knives, and the ever-watchful iron pot, that silence grew its sharpest teeth. The pot itself stood as both tool and terror. To the master and his family, it was the heart of the household, feeding them gumbo, stews, roasts thick with fat and spices. To the enslaved, it was an object of dread. They remembered the nights when the master, drunk and laughing, had forced a man's head down toward the pot's steam, holding him until skin blistered. They remembered how Lydia, the cook, once collapsed beneath its weight when the master struck her across the back with it, his cruelty clanging as loud as iron on bone. Yet iron remembers. Every strike leaves a ghost inside the metal. Every scream echoes in the hollow. The enslaved whispered that the pot was more than just iron, that it had grown hungry, absorbing pain until one day it would no longer serve cruelty, but answer it. In the glow of the firelight, the kitchen became a stage where shadows danced along the brick walls. Slaves moved in silence, chopping, stirring, carrying food that would never be theirs. But beneath that silence lay a current of something unsaid, a quiet that pressed against the edges of the room like a storm about to break. The narrator's voice sharpens. Iron that once fed cruelty will one day devour it. And with those words, the tale begins, not of food and fire, but of vengeance simmering long before the pot was lit. Louisiana in the year 1850 breathed heavy with heat, the kind that clung to skin like a second layer. The air was thick with the musk of swamps, the sweet rot of magnolia blossoms, and the endless hum of insects that never seemed to sleep. Moss-draped cypress trees leaned over the land like watchful sentinels, their long green tendrils swaying with the breeze, whispering secrets only the dead could hear. Beyond the trees stretched fields of sugar cane, acres upon acres swaying under the relentless sun. The stalks rose high, their edges sharp enough to slice a hand, their roots buried deep in soil watered with sweat and blood. Here, days blurred into seasons and seasons into lifetimes. Time did not move forward on the plantation. It circled endlessly, marked only by harvests, lashings, and the sound of chains. The rhythm of life was brutal and unyielding. At dawn, the overseer's horn split the air, dragging men and women from restless sleep. The fields devoured them by day, bending backs until spines cracked, hands raw from cutting cane that stood taller than the men who harvested it. At dusk, the whip snapped like thunder, ensuring no one forgot who commanded the earth and who merely bled into it. But the kitchen was its own world, a fiery heart that never stilled. Inside, smoke curled from blackened hearths, choking the air until eyes stung. Sweat dripped into pots, salt mixing with stew meant for a table the enslaved would never sit at. The master's feasts were heavy with roasted meat, buttered bread, and thick, spiced stews, food prepared by hands that would later scavenge scraps from the floor. The clang of iron lids and the hiss of boiling broth created a song of labor, one that spoke of hunger, exhaustion, and survival. At the center of this world stood the master. His shadow loomed larger than the house itself, his cruelty woven into the land. He was not merely feared, he was suffocating, a presence that filled every room, every corridor, every field. His laughter was a blade, his silence more dangerous still. On this plantation, even the air seemed to bow before him, heavy and unyielding, as though eternity itself had been shackled to his will. Lydia moved like a shadow through the kitchen, her steps soft on worn floorboards, her face an unreadable mask. To the master's family she was nothing more than a pair of skilled hands, a cook who never raised her voice, never questioned, never faltered. Her stews were praised, her breads devoured, her roasts declared the pride of the plantation. Yet while the family boasted of her skill, they never once looked her in the eyes. To them, Lydia was invisible, necessary but unseen, essential yet nameless. Her silence was their comfort. They mistook it for obedience, for resignation. But silence can be sharper than any blade. Behind her lowered eyes, behind the bow of her shoulders, something stirred, a storm gathering strength in secret. Every stir of the pot, every slice of the knife, every hiss of fire was more than labor. It was rehearsal. The kitchen was supposed to be her prison, the place where she served until her hands cracked and her back bent. But Lydia understood what her master did not. The kitchen was also a fortress of tools. The knives that cut meat could just as easily cut rope. The fire that softened bread could harden iron. The pot that fed cruelty could one day consume it. She lived each day among weapons disguised as utensils, waiting for the moment when the world would shift and the tools of servitude would become instruments of judgment. Outwardly, she played her role well. She nodded when spoken to, never let her gaze linger too long, and moved with the precision of someone who had long learned that even a glance could invite the lash. But her silence was not submission, it was concealment. Beneath it burned a steady flame, a vow she had whispered only to herself, that the same iron which had once broken her body would one day break the one who wielded it. In the stillness of night, when the embers glowed low and the house slept heavy, Lydia would stand by the iron pot and rest her hand on its rim. It was warm, solid, patient, like her, waiting. The air on the plantation began to shift, though no one could name it aloud. Lydia felt it first, small cracks splintering through the order the master had built with lash and chain. Overseers who once barked commands in unison now quarreled in the fields, snapping at one another with sharp suspicion. The mistress, pale and nervous, walked the halls at night with a candle trembling in her hand, muttering of shadows that lingered too long in corners. Among the enslaved, whispers carried in hushed tones. Omens in the sky, dreams of fire, the ancestors stirring restless beneath the soil. The house grew uneasy with every passing day, but the master, blind with arrogance, only laughed at the fear. He grew more reckless in his cruelty, more careless in his excess. Drunken evenings stretched late, his booming voice echoing through the halls while he mocked those forced to serve him. In these moments, Lydia moved silently through the room, pouring his wine, refilling his plate, her eyes lowered but her mind sharp. Each slurred insult, each careless strike of his hand across a servant's face, was another stone laid in the foundation of her resolve. At night, when the house slept, Lydia remained awake by the dying fire. She took the knives from their resting place and dragged the whetstone slowly across their edges. The sound was low, rhythmic, like breathing in the dark. Sometimes she would stir the empty pot with deliberate force, the clang reverberating against the brick walls like a drumbeat. It was as though she was speaking to the iron, reminding it, not yet, but soon. The breaking point came one night when the master, stumbling drunk from his chair, entered the kitchen with laughter as cruel as fire. Finding Lydia bent over the hearth, he lifted the iron pot with both hands and, in a mocking show of strength, brought it down hard across her back. The sound rang out, iron striking flesh and bone, the crash of humiliation. Lydia fell forward, her breath caught in her chest, but she did not cry out. She did not give him that victory. Instead, she pressed her hand against the floor and rose, steady, her silence colder than steel. That night, long after he had staggered back to his chamber, Lydia sat before the pot. Her back ached, her body trembled, but her eyes burned with quiet fire. What had once been mere endurance shifted into something far greater. The iron that had shamed her would not remain a weapon of cruelty forever. It would become the vessel of justice. It began with small things, so small that at first no one thought to notice. The master's appetite, once ravenous, soured. After meals, his laughter curdled into groans, his boasting gave way to clutching his stomach. Nights that had been filled with drunken snores now carried restless pacing, coughs muffled behind chamber doors. Fever bloomed on his skin, his face flushed one moment, pale the next. Yet each morning he demanded Lydia's food again, too arrogant to imagine that what fed him could also weaken him. The household stirred with unease. The mistress whispered of illness, her hands fluttering like pale moths as she wrung her kerchief. The overseers muttered more darkly. They watched Lydia with narrowed eyes as she ladled stew or scattered herbs into boiling water. They noted how the master's sickness always followed meals from her hand. Suspicion crept into their voices, into the set of their shoulders when she passed. Down in the quarters, the whispers took a different shape. Some said Lydia had learned the secret ways of herbs, knowledge carried in whispers from mother to daughter, passed through generations long before the lash and the chain. Others swore she was touched by spirits, her silence a shield that drew power from ancestors who refused to let their bloodline be broken. To some, she was dangerous. To others, she was chosen. Even the dogs seemed to sense it. Fierce beasts trained to track runaways began to growl low when she walked by, their hackles rising though she gave them no glance. One night when she passed the kennels, the dogs howled as if mourning, their cries shattering the stillness. The overseers crossed themselves, muttering of curses, though none dared say the word too loudly. In the kitchen, fires grew strange. Flames that should have burned steady flickered in odd rhythms, casting long shadows that seemed to move on their own. Smoke coiled upward in shapes that unsettled even the most hardened eyes. More than one servant swore they saw faces in the embers, fleeting but undeniable. The master raged at his weakness, striking harder at those around him, demanding stronger drink, harsher discipline, louder proof of his control. But control was slipping through his hands like sand. Each day the plantation bent a little further toward dread, as though the land itself waited for something to break. Fear no longer came from the lash. It seeped from the walls, from the earth, from the silence of a woman who stirred her pot and watched without speaking. Before the pot, before the scars across her back, there had been a child. A little girl with eyes like polished amber, quick hands that reached too eagerly for food after a long day in the fields. Lydia remembered her daughter's hunger most of all, the way her ribs pressed through her skin, the way she licked crumbs from her fingers as though they were feasts. One evening, the child had dared to take a crust of bread left cooling on the table. A crust no bigger than a fist, already hardened at the edges. The master had found her. His face red with drink, he had not struck the child, not directly. Instead, he decreed she would eat nothing for 3 days, to learn. 3 days under a sun that showed no mercy, 3 nights when her mother's arms could not shield her. By the 4th morning, the girl's small body lay still in the straw. Lydia had knelt beside her, rocking her gently, though warmth had already fled. She never screamed, never begged. Her grief was a quiet stone pressed deep into her chest. From that moment, Lydia's silence grew heavier and her eyes colder. Her husband had been sold long before that, auctioned off to settle a debt the master owed. Lydia still remembered the sound of chains rattling as he was marched away, his voice calling her name until distance swallowed it whole. Loss had become the fabric of her life, each thread pulled tighter until it bound her breath, her bones, her soul. And yet she did not break. There had been an elder once, an old woman who whispered wisdom when overseers' eyes turned elsewhere. She had leaned close to Lydia one evening while embers crackled low and said only, "Fire remembers." At the time, Lydia had not understood, but as years piled, as scars carved her body, she learned the truth of it. Fire holds memory, it consumes, but it does not forget. The same flame that warmed could also destroy. Now, as she stood before the iron pot, Lydia felt that whisper stir inside her like breath in the dark. Every bruise, every lash, every humiliation was not lost. They lived in her, in the iron, in the fire that had been forced upon her. Her silence had never been weakness. It was preparation, an ember waiting patient for the night when it would rise into flame. The summer sun sagged low, staining the sky with a bruised red when the visitor arrived at the plantation. He was a local preacher, or so he claimed, with dust on his boots and urgency in his voice. Others said he was close to the sheriff, a man who carried whispers as warnings, testing which houses trembled at their sound. He sat at the master's table, his hat in his lap, speaking low but firm of growing unrest. "Word is spreading," he said, eyes flicking toward the quarters beyond the fields. "Slaves whispering of fire and reckoning. They say some plan uprisings, some already begun. Louisiana will not sleep easy this season." The mistress paled, clutching her kerchief tighter. Overseers stiffened at the edges of the room, their hands brushing the hilts of their whips. But the master only leaned back in his chair and let out a great, booming laugh. His cheeks flushed with drink, his breath heavy with wine. He waved a hand dismissively as though brushing away a fly. "Unrest," he roared. "Fear is their only food, and I feed it well." He reached for the platter Lydia had set before him, tearing into the meat with greasy fingers. "Look at her," he said, pointing a thick hand toward Lydia where she stood by the hearth. Silent as stone, she wouldn't dare raise her eyes, much less a hand. They are all the same, obedient when beaten, useful when kept hungry. The talk of revolt is nothing but ghost stories for weak men. The preacher shifted uneasily but said no more. The overseers exchanged glances, their jaws tight, their knuckles pale. The mistress lowered her gaze, her candle-lit shadow trembling against the wall. The air grew thick in the room, as though the very walls leaned closer to listen. Lydia did not move. She stood motionless by the fire, her hands folded in front of her apron. But her eyes, though downcast, burned. Each word he spat, each bite he tore, sank into her like kindling, feeding flame. She had heard his laughter too many times, seen too much blood spilled at his command. His mockery did not wound her, it confirmed her path. That night when the plates were cleared and the candles snuffed, Lydia returned to the kitchen alone. The pot waited, blackened with years of smoke, heavy with the memory of every cruelty it had carried. She laid her hand upon its rim, her silence now not merely endurance but judgment. She had chosen her night. She had chosen her method, and soon the iron would remember. The night was thick with heat, the air heavy and unmoving, as though the world itself held its breath. The master had drunk more than usual, his voice echoing down the halls long after the house had gone still. His laughter slurred, his steps uneven, until at last he stumbled toward the kitchen, lured by the scent of smoke and the thought of more wine. Lydia waited in silence. The hearth roared, flames licking the black belly of the iron pot, its lid set aside like an open mouth. Shadows shivered across the brick walls, stretching and twisting with every flicker of firelight. She stood as she always did, quiet, composed, her back bowed in feigned obedience. But her hands were steady, her eyes fixed. The night had come. The master swaggered in, sneering, his breath sour with liquor. "Still awake, are you?" he jeered, leaning his bulk against the table. "My faithful cook, my silent shadow." He staggered closer, reaching for the ladle as though to mock her again. But before the words could form on his lips, Lydia lifted the very iron pot he had once struck her with and brought it down upon his skull. The sound was sickening, iron against bone, sharp and final. He collapsed to the floor, groaning, his hands clawing at the earth. For the first time, silence belonged to him. Lydia moved quickly with the precision of years spent obeying orders. She bound his wrists with rope stolen from the larder, dragged his heavy body inch by inch across the floor toward the fire. His eyes fluttered open, confusion bleeding into terror as he realized where she led him. He tried to speak, but no words came, only guttural gasps. The iron pot loomed above them both, its heat searing, its surface alive with memory. With strength drawn from every scar, every humiliation, Lydia forced him inside. His body writhed, his muffled cries rattled against the iron walls, but the vessel held him as it had held every cruelty before. She slammed the lid shut, sealing him into the very instrument of his violence. The kitchen became a furnace of reckoning. The fire roared louder, smoke coiled upward in choking spirals, the air thick with the scent of burning. From within the pot came the muffled pounding of fists, the desperate, strangled screams that grew weaker with each passing moment. Lydia stood over it all, silent, her face bathed in firelight. She did not weep. She did not smile. She only watched as the iron devoured what it had been promised. And when at last the screams ceased, the silence was absolute, heavier than chains, deeper than the grave. By dawn, the plantation was no longer a place of order but of ruin. The kitchen's hearth was blackened, its smoke still curling into the sky like a signal of judgment. When the overseers forced themselves to look inside, they staggered back in horror, their faces pale, their hands trembling as if touched by something unholy. The master was gone, devoured by iron and flame. Panic spread swiftly. Some overseers mounted their horses and rode hard for the road, abandoning their posts without a word. Others muttered of curses and witchcraft, their voices breaking as they crossed themselves in trembling haste. Within hours, the proud house that had stood as a symbol of dominance fell silent, its halls echoing not with authority but with dread. Among the enslaved, whispers rippled like wind through cane. Some saw the chaos as their chance and fled into the swamps, their footprints swallowed quickly by mud and water. Others remained, bound not by chains but by fear, afraid that leaving would only carry the curse further with them. In every corner of the quarters, the same question passed from mouth to mouth. What became of Lydia? No trace of her was ever found. Some swore they saw her slip into the night, vanishing into the moss-draped woods, her silence trailing behind her like a veil. Others claimed she had walked calmly into the fire, joining the flames that had answered her call, her body unburned but her spirit freed. The truth became as elusive as smoke. The land itself bore the mark of what had been done. Crops withered no matter how hard the field hands labored. The cane stalks grew brittle, their sweetness gone. Dogs, once ferocious hunters, cowered and whimpered if driven near the kitchen ruins, refusing to cross the scorched threshold. At night, the embers of the hearth seemed to glow again, faint but insistent, as though the fire had not truly died. What had once been a place of wealth and cruelty became a place avoided, its silence heavier than before, its soil steeped in fear. The master was gone, but his absence was no victory. It was a haunting, a wound carved into the land itself. Decades passed, and the Louisiana plantation rotted into memory. The once proud house collapsed in on itself, its shutters hanging loose, its walls swallowed by vines. The cane fields grew wild, untended, as if the earth itself refused to yield sweetness where so much bitterness had been sown. Travelers on the river road would glance at the ruins from a distance but rarely drew close. They called it cursed ground, a place where even the birds grew silent when they flew overhead. Children whispered the stories most vividly. On humid summer nights when the moon hung heavy and low, they said the iron pot still glowed faintly in the dark. No fire warmed its belly, yet steam rose from its rim as though something inside still boiled. Some claimed they had heard it, slow, deliberate bubbling sounds, rising and falling like breath. Others swore they heard muffled cries trapped within the metal, fists pounding from the inside though no one touched it. Older folk told their own versions. A man traveling home by lantern swore he saw a figure in the kitchen's shadow, tall, still, and unmistakably a woman. Her face was hidden, but her hands rested on the pot as though guarding it, her silence heavier than any chain. Another visitor claimed he saw smoke unfurl from the chimney, though the hearth had been cold for half a century. When he stepped closer, he said the smoke carried the shape of a woman's profile before dissolving into night. The overseers who had once survived never spoke of that night. Some fled Louisiana altogether, muttering of curses that followed them in dreams. Those who stayed kept their distance, crossing themselves whenever the subject arose, as though even remembering might summon her. In time, the tale of Lydia grew beyond fact into folklore. She was no longer just a woman but a haunting, an avenger bound to iron, a spirit that could not be silenced. Parents warned their children never to steal food from others, never to mock the hungry, lest Lydia's pot find them too. And yet one detail remained constant in every retelling. Those who dared to step close to the rusting pot claimed they saw something carved faintly into its rim, letters blackened and rough, as if branded by smoke and heat itself. The word was simple, unshakable, etched for eternity. Lydia. Stories like Lydia's aren't just tales of the past. They are echoes of real pain, real resistance, and the unbroken spirit of a people who refuse to be silenced. If this story moved you, if it stirred something in your heart, I ask you to carry it forward. Leave your thoughts in the comments, because remembering together is how we honor those who came before us. And if you believe stories like this must continue to be told, so they're never forgotten, please subscribe. Join us, so the voices that were once forced into silence will keep speaking through us.